Up. Recess. If you'll check, make sure that the notebook you have is your notebook. And Mr. Arbor, is there further cross-examination, sir?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. May I continue?
Yes, sir.
Right,
If you can make sure your microphone's on, please, sir.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Wallace. Continuing on from where we left off, what I was asking, I think, before the break was the fact that when the campaigns got large, like a congressman's campaign, they have both the volunteers and the paid staffers that we talked about. Those paid staffers, they're paid from the money that comes into that campaign account, correct?
Yes, generally, yes.
And in order to pay, salaries to people, I mean, particularly with a U.S. congressman, the monies that come in on a regular basis to these campaign accounts can be fairly significant at times. Isn't that true?
Sir, my role with respect to the Miller campaign was service as the treasurer. I was not immersed in the campaign, so to speak, so that I'm not able to offer, from personal knowledge, observations about the size of the staff, the role of the staff, or even whether there was paid staff.
That's fine. The point I'm making, though, is that we're not talking like when a candidate, particularly one in Congress, and I'm basing this not just solely on your experience with the Brad Miller campaign, but all your past experiences with working with these things. A U.S. congressman is going to have a number of benefactors that are making regular contributions to the campaign account. Wouldn't that be fair to say?
As I indicated earlier, there are contribution limits which are applicable to individual contributors' contributions to a candidate committee. There are contribution limits applicable to a political committee's contribution to a candidate committee. And those limits have varied over time, but they're relatively low. So contributors may contribute in a primary election and then may contribute again in a general election, but the size of an individual contribution is limited by law and is fairly low.
I understand. In fact, the limits are based upon an election cycle. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
For example, in a particular year, if a candidate is running for office, he may have a primary for that office, correct?
Correct.
That would be a cycle.
That's an election, yes.
Right, and someone could make a contribution during that cycle. If there was some type of a number of candidates and it resulted in some type of a runoff election between two candidates, that is yet another cycle, and someone could make another contribution in that.
That's
cycle.
yet another election for which another contribution would be permitted by law, yes.
Correct. And then there would be the general election, of course, and then the person can make a contribution for that cycle as well, right?
For that election, yes.
The point I'm making is, you're right, there is limits on how much people can give, but there are certain benefactors who are, proponents of a particular candidate. They want to see that candidate stay in office. They make regular contributions to the limits permitted to them. And sometimes these accounts can get up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Isn't that fair?
The bank balances of a candidate committee, yes, they can get it into the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
It is from that money that the expenses are paid, like the rent and the people who work for the campaign committee and all of that, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. In this particular instance, and this, I think you can disagree with me if I'm wrong about this. It would be fair to say that in recent years, what's happened is that a lot of candidates, particularly candidates holding larger offices where there's more money coming in, have done this thing where they've hired a service, as the kind that Ms. Hahn was offering, where they will basically come in and say, you pay us a monthly fee, and in exchange for that monthly fee, we'll take over some of the office responsibilities of the campaign committee. Is that about accurate? It's probably simplifying it, but...
It's certainly simplifying it. This was in 2011 when Sky Blue began to provide services to the Miller committee. It was very early in the election cycle, so it would have been unusual, in my view, to have paid campaign staff, employees, on a committee payroll as early as that. But not unusual to have a consultant in place, as was the case here.
And when you say consultant, again, they're not there solely to just maintain the checking account. They're there to do a number of different things, right?
Yes, my understanding was that Sky Blue had both fundraising responsibility as well as campaign management responsibility.
Yeah, basically you pay a company like Sky Blue Strategies, when I say you, I mean the campaign account, pays Sky Blue Strategies a monthly amount. I think when they were first starting, it was something over $6,000 a month, correct?
That's consistent with my memory.
Yeah,
yes.
Like maybe $6,250 or something of that nature.
Yes, sir.
And that was a monthly payment. That was like a regular monthly expense of the campaign account. You pay that amount to Sky Blue Strategies, and they'll, in exchange for that, perform a certain number of functions, correct?
Correct.
One of which was to, as you already testified about, maintain the bank account for the campaign account, correct?
Yes, sir.
Collect the mail, organize fundraisers, whatever else the contract was. They had a number of different things they were supposed to do, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I think you said that prior to 2011, prior to the hiring of Sky Blue Strategy, you were the treasurer. There was a different outfit or maybe individual that was doing this service instead of Sky Blue Strategies, correct?
Correct.
Was it somebody by the name of Keating or something of that nature?
The entity which contracted with the committee was, I believe, Ad Astra. And Ad Astra was an organization that was staffed by Maggie Barlow and Tom Keating.
Okay. Just a different company that sort of did the same thing that Sky Blue Strategies was engaged to do, correct?
I believe so. I was not involved, as I say, in the campaign, and so was not able to observe the breadth and the scope of the responsibilities of Ad Astra or Sky Blue.
That was sort of one of the reasons why I'm asking you some of these questions about the staffers and the people that they hire in a campaign. You as the treasurer, it's not your job to be involved in the day-to-day workings of a campaign. Wouldn't that be fair?
Some treasurers might be. That was not the role that I undertook in behalf of this committee.
Oftentimes, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, oftentimes the candidate will have people that do all the work. They get the bank accounts squared away. They raise the money. They pay the expenses. But there has to be someone who's going to sign off on things when the reports go in to the Elections Commission, correct?
Correct.
Whether you're a state candidate or a federal candidate, correct?
Correct.
And it doesn't hurt, if you're a candidate, to have someone who's well-respected and knowledgeable about this stuff being your campaign treasurer. Would that be fair?
It makes sense to have someone in a position of treasurer who has some familiarity with the statutory scheme and the reporting responsibilities of the committee, yes.
Right. You don't have to be modest here. I mean, there's not a lot of people that do what you do. And so being a lawyer, a Democratic lawyer, a lawyer who knows election law, a lawyer who's been doing it for 30 years, a lawyer who's known other candidates and probably assisted with other candidates, you're not an illogical choice for a candidate to go pick and say, hey, would you be my treasurer?
Correct.
But what they're not asking you to do is show up at the office every day and open the mail and check the bank accounts. There are people to do that.
In this model, that is the model that was adopted by the Miller Committee, yes, my role was service as the treasurer in the technical legal sense, and there were others who had the broader responsibilities of running the campaign.
Yeah, I think what and you correct me, I think what you're suggesting is it would not be out of the realm of possibility to go and hire someone like you who, and say, listen, I want you to run the show. I want you to do all that stuff. I want you to check the bank accounts. I want you to check that stuff. But it's not required of a treasurer, is it?
The treasurer's role is primarily supervision of the reporting responsibilities of the committee.
It's the person who every quarter when you got to file that report with the Elections Commission is the person who, all right, bring me what you got. Let me take a look at it. Make sure everything looks like it's okay. If everything looks like it's copacetic, you sign it, you send it off.
Generally, yes.
And that's sort of what you were trying to, I think you were telling us about when you were testifying earlier about your meetings with Ms. Hahn and our client, Jonathan Broyhill. And by the way, I don't think you were asked to do it, but the gentleman sitting at our table, that is Jonathan. That's the person you know.
Yes.
Okay. Now, and those meetings you had with them, I think you said they're about a half an hour once every quarter to sit down, show me what you got, everything looks good, sign it off, and pretty much for your role, at least in this particular campaign, that's what you were that was what was expected of you, correct?
Yes, I had interest, though, in the success of the campaign. When the campaign first started, I had interest in the success of the campaign. So we had conversations that certainly went beyond my technical legal responsibility, but those meetings were in fulfillment of my legal responsibilities for the committee.
Sure, a candidate's not just going to go look for someone to be their treasurer who's hoping they're going to lose the race, right?
Right.
You go find someone who's going to support you and, be someone. I mean, technically, you're one of the people at the top of the letterhead when a candidate's running for office. There's John Wallace, treasurer, listed on the head. It sort of sends out a message. Hey, we got this guy is our treasurer.
And I don't know whether I ever appeared on the letterhead of the Miller Committee, but you're describing a model that once upon a time existed where the campaign treasurer was a prominent name for other reasons. My role was primarily the reporting responsibility.
To make sure that the reports got in and that, ultimately the one who's signing off on it is you.
Yes, that's correct.
So everybody else is doing the work on it, but at the end of the day, you have to sign off on it. So if there's going to be someone who has to answer questions, they're going to come at you. So you have a certain amount of oversight you do want to put on it because your name's going on it. That's the one that's going in. They're not going to call Jamie Hahn or John Broyhill. The FEC is going to call you.
Correct.
And you're the one that has to answer the questions.
Correct.
All right. And in 2011, when Sky Blue Strategies was engaged, at that point, that's where I was getting back to the questions I was asking earlier. Congressman Miller had no reason to believe when he hired them that it was going to be any different than it had been since 2002. The other agency, I don't think there was a problem with the other agency, was there? I think they just moved, right? The Astra or whatever you called them.
I believe that the decision to utilize Sky Blue came as a consequence of discussions to which I was not a party. I never asked for any explanation for why that came about. But my understanding was that Sky Blue would take on, for my purposes, the role that Ad Astra
was it your understanding that Sky Blue had been referred to Congressman Miller by other political candidates?
I did not know that, but certainly believe that to be the case. I did not at that time know Sky Blue, had never worked with Sky Blue before.
This was a new agency for you to work with in your 30 years. You'd not worked with them before.
I had not worked with Sky Blue, and though I knew Ms. Hahn's name, I had not met her.
You knew the name because Ms. Hahn was very active in other Democratic Party functions. Would that be fair?
I feel certain that that's how I knew her name, yes.
So when she was hired in 2011, would it be fair to say that at that particular point in time, the Congressman Miller campaign was pretty much gearing itself up to run for re-election?
I think at that point, Congressman Miller anticipated running for election. The district which he served was redrawn such that he no longer resided in it. So he was confronted with the question of where to run and whether to run.
That was my next question. By 2010, the Republican Party had taken control of the General Assembly here in North Carolina.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
When that happened, they redrew some of these districts, correct?
Correct.
When they did that, Congressman Miller was now placed into a district that stretched him into areas where his prior constituent voters did not exist, right?
As I recall, his residence was drawn into the 4th Congressional District. And that 4th Congressional District included as redrawn, included parts of Durham, Chapel Hill, and stretched all the way down to Fayetteville.
Like North Raleigh and all the way to Surrey County, things like that.
The district was not the same district from which he had been elected in prior election cycles.
Right, and in this new district that his new district is with it being redrawn, and this is part of politics too. One of the things that politicians do, and because you've got experience in it, is that they can study the voting patterns of what voters do within certain districts, correct?
I think that does occur, and I think that did occur in connection with the drawing of the districts in 2011. And
suddenly the district that Congressman Miller previously represented, now redrawn, put him in from a Democratic district to a predominantly Republican district.
I believe that's correct, yes.
So also there was put him like slightly by like some yards or feet or something like that, actually out into a different district represented by a different Democratic congressman, correct?
My recollection is that his residence was placed into the district by the drawing of a district line, placed into the district served by Congressman David Price.
So now, were he to run for re-election, now he's living in a district where he would be in competition with a fellow Democrat who's been seated in the Congress, I believe, longer than him at that point, correct?
Correct.
And were he to go to the district that, because he could have moved, but he'd be moving, to move into the district that he was representing, he'd be moving into a district that was now primarily Republican.
I think that's correct.
So rather than run against a colleague, and rather than move into a district where his likelihood of success was significantly reduced, he made the decision not to run for re-election. Would that be a fair assessment?
I don't know what the determining factors were. Those certainly would have been considerations as he moved toward a decision about whether to run in 2012.
He made the announcement not to run for re-election in January of 2012. Isn't that correct?
I believe that's correct.
So it was early in the year, well before the election. Now, election time for a candidate pretty much typically starts the day after the election, correct? In some senses.
With a 2-year term in a district that is closely contested, that's certainly the case. Of course.
So after, in other words, after last campaign, which would have been in 2010, I mean, basically at that point, you're getting ready to run for the next election in 2012. Assuming that it is your plan to stay in office and not retire.
Yes, although everyone knew that the district lines would be redrawn in 2011. So though he anticipated mounting a campaign in 2012, he did not have knowledge at that time in early 2011 as to what district he might be competing for.
Because the lines hadn't been drawn yet.
Correct.
One of the things he did, when you say not sure what he's going to do, you could anticipate that the lines were going to be redrawn, but until he knew what the lines were going to be, he really couldn't make the decision about whether he was going to run or not. So at the point where he engaged Sky Blue Strategies, his mindset, it would have been, as the treasurer's campaign, I'm running for something, potentially running for something. Would that be fair?
I think he anticipated running again for Congress and hoped to be running again for Congress, but did not have, nor did any other candidate for Congress, have information as to where the district lines would be.
Right. My point being this, because you were shown the exhibit of the report from the first quarter of 2013 and I think the last quarter of 2012. Those were relatively dormant times for the campaign because at that point, Representative Miller has already said, I'm not running, correct?
Correct.
But previous to that, previous to his making his announcement in January of 2012 that he wasn't going to run for re-election, at that point, sort of like all things, there were all kinds of possibilities. He might run in the district. He might look at a different district. He might run for a different office, correct?
Certainly possible.
So my point being that in 2011, when Sky Blue Strategies was hired, they weren't at that point thinking about, we're going to shut this thing down. They were thinking about, we may be running for something and I need a strategist and I want someone to help me with fundraising and managing things. Thus, the other company's gone. I'm going to hire Sky Blue Strategies on somebody's, probably on some other politician's recommendation.
And I don't know how that came about, but yes, that would be the logic of hiring Sky Blue, was in anticipation of the 2012 election cycle.
Now, you don't deal with the day-to-day in the sense of you're not down at that office, looking for every single donation check that's coming in to a U.S. congressman. You get people that will send in a check for $2 and some that might send some in the thousands, right?
Certainly.
Right. That's what all the staffers and other people were doing, correct?
Correct.
And when you are, would it be fair to say, and you can answer this from your 30 years of experience and having done this before, when you're a seated politician, when you're active in office, and you're active in office, and your constituents, the people that support you and think that want you to be in office, are there. There's sort of particularly in these Congress seats that are running every 2 years, there's a constant flow of donations coming in throughout it's hard to say an election cycle. They're just coming in all the time from different donors, right?
I think it is the practice of a campaign such as the Miller campaign to formulate a fundraising strategy, and that fundraising strategy might include local events. It might include mail solicitations, email solicitations, and it might include events in the District of Columbia. But it's not my experience that contributions flow just continuously and spontaneously, but it's part of a campaign plan.
I'm just saying there may be a voter out there who says, well, I really like Congressman Miller in my district and I want to make sure that, he stays in office. If he wants to write a $20 check, there's nothing prohibiting him or her from doing that.
Oh, certainly not.
Right. But like you say, after an election's over, the last thing somebody wants to get in their mail or on their email or whatever is a solicitation of, okay, let's get the next one going. Can you send me a check for the next election? That's sort of bad marketing strategy, right?
I think there are lots of situations in which donors are eager to get started, just as candidates are eager to get started.
Some can be. That's one of the purposes of hiring a strategist, figuring out what's the good time to do these things, and who do you ask, and how do you get their money? Shall we have a party? Shall we host an event? And things of that nature, correct?
Yes, sir.
That's part of what Sky Blue Strategies' responsibilities was. I realize you didn't have to be versed as the treasurer with all of their responsibilities, but based upon your experience and your knowledge of this stuff, that's sort of your understanding of what they were hired to do, correct?
I believe that was part of their responsibility, yes, sir.
In fact, I believe your testimony was that Sky Blue Strategies essentially was, at least as far as your working with them, was essentially the two people, Jamie Hahn and Jonathan Broyhill, correct?
They were the only two persons that I met from Sky Blue Strategy.
And in the way that business ran, and again, you correct me if I'm wrong, you remember telling officers when you were interviewed about this, that your surmisal of their roles was that Ms. Hahn was more of the fundraiser. She was like the big idea person. Mr. Broyhill was the clerk. He was the person who was sort of taking care of the paperwork and the things of that nature.
I believe that to be true, and I believe that's consistent with what I provided to the officers, yes.
Again, you're not looking at the bank accounts that are coming in on a monthly basis. That's not your role. But you do fill out, you do sign off on the reports that are filed quarterly. Once the decision is made by a congressman, and just from a legal standpoint, once Congressman Miller decides, I'm not going to run for re-election, that doesn't prohibit someone from making a donation to his campaign.
No, he could maintain that committee in active status, though he was not immediately seeking office.
And sometimes candidates who leave office will do that. Just keep the campaign active because they may run for something else, or they have a lot of debt and they plan on having some kind of fundraisers and things to help retire that debt.
Certainly.
When we say retire the debt, it basically means to get the money back to pay off what the campaign owes, right?
Yes, sir.
Because most campaigns, particularly ones of this size, they owe money. They don't just get money in from the donors. They're spending money, right?
Yes, sir.
They're not just the events and the mailing and rent for their office and the people that work there, telephone, all that stuff. There's money going out on a monthly basis, correct?
Yes, sir.
So when you're doing those reports, you're seeing that. You're seeing these statements that show these are the disbursements over the past quarter.
Yes, sir.
And you're seeing the money that comes in over the past quarter.
Yes, sir.
When a congressman then makes a decision like Congressman Miller did to say, well, you know what, I'm going to withdraw for re-election, suddenly, there's no real incentive for the average voter to say, well, why would I make donations to that individual? He's not running for office this year. So the revenue coming in decreased significantly, correct?
I believe that to be the case, yes.
And once the revenue began to decrease, the one thing that the campaign has to do in the, what we would call, let's say, winding down, is to reduce its expenses. It can't keep operating the way it did because it doesn't have the money coming in anymore, right?
Some expenses are no longer necessary expenses of a campaign that's winding down, and other expenses would certainly need to be reduced in light of the fact that the campaign is winding down, yes.
But if you still have an office and you still have phones and you still have supplies you're buying and whatever else, you're still paying Sky Blue Strategies, which got reduced, correct?
At a point later in time, and I don't sort of recall exactly when that was, the monthly fee payable to Sky Blue was reduced in light of the fact that it wasn't a campaign for election, but a winding down of a committee.
And now the responsibilities of your understanding, if you don't have this understanding, you correct me, but the responsibilities of Sky Blue Strategies changed after Congressman Miller decided not to run for election for an office that year.
I believe that's correct, yes.
They went from being a company that was hired to help get a candidate reelected to a company that was, well, we'll continue to pay you at a reduced rate, but for the purpose of winding this down.
Correct.
Okay. And the two individuals that you continued to work with throughout 2012 was Jamie Hahn and my client, correct?
Correct.
Now, as you said, there were typically only those 30-minute meetings that occurred. And I'm not holding you to 30 minutes. I'm sure you weren't sitting in your office with a, watch timing how long you're having the meeting with Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill, but your best estimate was like 30 minutes, and you'd go over the stuff, and then the report would be filed. You'd put your electronic signature on it for the Federal Elections Commission.
I would authorize the filing of the report electronically, which was done from the computer maintained by or for the committee on which the NGP database and the NGP software were maintained.
Let's talk about that a little bit. That NGP software, that's basically a software program that sort of ties in with the Federal Elections Commission, correct? That's not fair. It's not the Federal Elections Commission, but what it does is it's like sort of like a QuickBooks thing where it helps you make your reports, it monitors your money, it helps put these reports together that you need to file quarterly with the FEC.
The NGP software is software which can be purchased with one or more modules. The core function is the management of receipt of contributions and the reporting of those, the expenditures of monies and the reporting of those expenditures, utilizing the data that was gathered in the creation of a form prescribed by the Federal Election Commission. NGP, though, maintains the NGP software maintains a database which can be used for a variety of other reasons by a candidate committee.
And I think you said, you're not professing to be some authority on NGP. But you have a conceptual understanding of how the thing works.
I believe I do, yes.
When you met with Ms. Hahn and Jonathan, in fact, do you recall telling officers in some of your interviews that there were times when you'd always meet with John? Ms. Hahn was not always there, but a lot of the times.
That's correct.
I'm going to ask you refer to individuals by their surname, Mr. Broyhill, etc., Ms. Hahn, things of that sort.
All right, no, my objection to that, Your Honor. So my client would be at all the meetings. Ms. Hahn would be at some or most of the meetings. Would that be fair?
I believe that to be the case, yes. I believe there were circumstances in which Mr. Broyhill was present without Ms. Hahn. I don't recall circumstances but readily in which Ms. Hahn was present without Mr. Broyhill.
You recall after Ms. Hahn passed away, and all of a sudden that created a lot of flurry about what was going on because you knew you had just met with these people the week before. You had, of course, we talked about you had to talk to police officers about this event, right?
Yes, sir.
And about your meeting with them the week prior, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. You remember telling officers that this was just your observation, that it seemed that Ms. Hahn didn't, I think your words were, didn't have as much of a grip on the money as Mr. Broyhill did?
I think that during the course of that time period, from the start of the relationship in 2011 into 2013, there was perhaps less engagement by Ms. Hahn with respect to the campaign's finances, as might be expected, given that over that period of time, the demands on Sky Blue were lessening, and the role that she was filling was, that is to say, of campaign strategy and fundraising, was greatly diminished, of course, by the fact that he was not, Congressman Miller was not seeking office. Whereas the reporting responsibilities on the part of the committee continued unabated, notwithstanding the fact that Mr. Miller was not seeking re-election.
But the question I have, pretty sure, is do you recall telling officers in your interviews after these events that and I say officers, it might have been with an officer, it might have been with you did have meetings with police officers after this event. You had subsequent meetings as well, both with police and with the district attorney's office in preparation of this trial. Would that be correct? Interviews.
As I recall, sir, I met and or talked by telephone with one or more police officers in 2013, and then beginning at some point in 2014, I met with one or more representatives of the district attorney's office.
In those meetings, do you recall saying or telling anybody that Jamie was the campaign manager but didn't seem to have a grip on what money was coming in or coming out, and which seemed unusual to you for a campaign manager?
Well, in the early going, the task that she had was fundraising. And in the early going, I certainly felt that she was completely immersed in and aware of the activities of that campaign. But it was just less than a year after that Congressman Miller announced his decision not to run, and her role, that is to say, her role as campaign manager and strategist with respect to fundraising, diminished immediately, abruptly, and her need to be involved in all those aspects of the campaign diminished. And therefore, during that time period, 2012 into 2013, her role did evolve considerably. I don't know exactly how they divided up responsibilities within the office, but the role that she had fulfilled was a role that the campaign did not any longer need. The strategy and the planning of fundraising activities was not a role that the campaign needed.
I understand. My question is, do you recall making the comment in one of those interviews that, and you may have been referring to the time after Congressman Miller decided not to run for re-election, that considering, and maybe you were talking about that in light of the fact that this is a winding down time, there's no need for the raising of money anymore because he's not running for office. Do you recall making the comment that Ms. Hahn didn't seem to have a grip on the money coming in and coming out, and that seemed unusual to you for a campaign manager?
I think I probably did say that, and I think it was probably in reference to the later time periods where
When it should have been winding
her
down.
role had evolved
To a winding down.
to a
period.
winding down role, which did not require as much of her side of Sky Blue as it did of Mr. Broyhill's side of Sky Blue.
This was, but the mere fact that she may not have had a grip on the money wasn't that big of an issue with you, because for the most part, with respect to the money things, when there were questions to be asked and information needed, you were mostly dealing with Mr. Broyhill. Would that be fair? For what your limited role was.
I think that Mr. Broyhill demonstrated in the course of my work with Sky Blue his hands-on involvement with the bank accounts and the reporting functions. And so that when and if questions arose during the course of these periodic meetings about financial issues, he would likely have been the first one to whom I would direct a question. I recall, though, that when I had questions about the request for additional information and the communication from the commission indicating that our report was not timely filed, I wrote both Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill. And I didn't have a single point of contact with Sky Blue and deemed each of them to have a role at that time.
Well, as a matter of fact, in looking at that exhibit that you looked at this morning when you were addressing it for help, not that you weren't directing it to both of them, but sort of like in the two for the email, it went to Mr. Broyhill and you CC'd Ms. Hahn. You were letting them both know, but you directed the first email to Mr. Broyhill. Give me some help. Explain this thing to me. Would that be correct?
I believe he is in the two line, but I wouldn't put much weight on that. My typing skills and my email skills are relatively modest.
I can most definitely identify with you on that, sir.
So I didn't see it. I didn't see.
You were letting them both know.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay.
I ask you this because before that meeting on April 15th, which was a Monday, we're in agreement, that was a Monday.
Yes, that's correct.
It was 1 week before this crime occurred.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Before that meeting, you knew that there was going to be a meeting because the April 15th Monday date was the filing date, correct?
Yes.
So typically you'd want to meet prior to that so that you can know it's all done and have it submitted. You can submit early, right?
Yes. Certainly no prohibition on submitting early, but one must wait for the close of the reporting period, and the close of the reporting period came at the end of March.
Right. In other words, the first quarter of the month is January 1st till March 31st, but any time after that between then and April, but no later, so say any time from March 31st, but no later than April 15th, the quarterly report for the first quarter of 2013 could have been filed.
Correct.
Right. So there was opportunity to submit the report prior. It's just that on this day, the 15th of April, when you were meeting with them, that was sort of like the 11th hour, last day to do it, correct?
I had been contacted by Ms. Hahn during the week before and asked to meet with Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn with regard to the report. And we had agreed on a date and time, and I don't know whether that was Wednesday or Thursday of the week prior.
There was supposed to be a meeting the week prior to the 15th.
There was, and then I received another email communication from Ms. Hahn who requested that I put the meeting back to Monday morning because of other scheduled events that conflicted with our meeting.
Right. It wasn't, and this was a request that came to you from whoever at Sky Blue Strategies. You weren't asking for the postponement. It was them asking you, can we put this over till the 15th? Would that be correct?
It was Ms. Hahn, and she was asking that we put the meeting back to Monday the 15th, correct?
Right, just so we're clear. It wasn't anything that, all of a sudden you had a court date pop up or something like that, or you had to meet with a client and say, hey, I can't do it today. Can you come in Monday? It was them asking you for the postponement, correct?
It was Ms. Hahn asking me for that.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that I know the reasons for that. In fact, I'm sure I don't, but I do remember that she made that request.
Just trying to make sure it wasn't you. You weren't the one asking for the
No.
postponement. Okay. One of the things that was an issue at that time was about repayment of a loan to Congressman Miller, correct?
In the winding down activities, one of the anticipated activities was the repayment of the indebtedness to Congressman Miller. And so when I looked at the report and saw that those debts were still outstanding, I raised that question.
Those loans that you were referring to in your testimony earlier were with respect to certain loans that Congressman Miller would have at some point made to his federal election campaign, correct?
Correct.
But you were aware of that another issue, and if you weren't, you correct me, that Congressman Miller had an outstanding debt owed to him from his prior state campaign account. Isn't that correct?
I believe that is correct. I was not the treasurer of that committee nor the custodian of its records, but I believe that is correct.
Correct. And you weren't the custodian of those records, and you weren't the treasurer of the state account. But this is a colleague. He's the candidate. You're the treasurer of his federal election campaign. You know the candidate. You talk to the candidate. I mean, you know Brad Miller. This is not some stranger that you're dealing with.
Oh, certainly.
Right. So he had an amount of money that back in the day when he was a state assemblyman and possibly a state senator, that he had purportedly loaned to his campaign, and he wanted it to be repaid, correct?
I'm sorry, Mr. Arbor, are you referring to his state committee or to his federal committee?
Well, there were two aspects. There were some loans made to the federal campaign account, right?
Yes, sir.
And he expected his federal campaign account to pay the loans back to him, correct?
Yes, sir.
And there'd be no prohibition to the federal campaign account paying him that money that was owed to him. Isn't that true?
Correct.
Okay. But he had at one time in his life been this state politician before he went into the U.S. Congress, correct?
Yes, sir.
And when he was a state politician, he had a state campaign account, correct?
Correct.
And that campaign account was still in existence, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And when that existed, even though he became a U.S. congressman, he didn't shut that account down, correct?
Correct. And
there was still a debt in that account owed to him.
I believe that to be true.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with the particulars of it.
There was, however, a discussion about whether or not the federal campaign account, which had more money than the state account, could pay back his state debt, correct?
The federal committee could not lawfully repay his state debt.
Well,
not directly so. No.
Not directly so. Let me get into that with you a little bit. If you and I acknowledge there was a state account, you at least knew of a loan that Congressman Miller had made to that state account on some previous occasion, correct?
I believe that to be the case, yes.
And he was looking to have that loan paid back.
I would expect that would be his hope, yes.
I mean, you've known him as an attorney, but Congressman Miller has been in elected office. In 2013, when this is all happening, He's been in elected office since 1992. Does that sound about right to you?
I couldn't disagree with you about that.
And he's been a U.S. congressman since 2002, correct?
Yes, sir.
And now we're when he makes the decision in 2012 not to run for re-election, he's been in the U.S. Congress for essentially 10 years, correct?
Yes.
And when you decide not to run, or you get beat in an election, which was not the case here, but you decide not to run for re-election, you get to December 31st of 2012, and your term in office ends, correct?
Correct.
You are now officially unemployed. Not you, but Congressman Miller was.
Well, his term as a member of Congress would come to an end at that point, yes, sir.
Right, but they're not going to keep paying him when he's not a congressman anymore.
No.
So he's out of a job, which is not uncommon. That happens with candidates that lose an office,
Certainly.
right? But he's not going to have a paycheck coming in anymore, right?
Not from his employment as a member of Congress, correct.
Correct. To the best of your knowledge, he had not secured any employment with a law firm or anything of that nature, correct? At that point.
I'm not sure at what time he did secure employment with a law firm, but he did secure employment with a law firm.
I understand that. But at the time in January when he was going to be finishing his term and leaving Congress, at that point, to the best of your knowledge, he wasn't like segueing in from Congress into another job at that point.
I don't know when he began an employment relationship with a law firm.
All right. But fair to say, if he was gonna wrap it up, he wanted to make sure that if there was money in this somewhere to repay him any loans he's made to his campaigns, let's get that squared away. Would that be fair?
Well, I think, focusing for the moment on the United States Congress and his service in the Congress, the district lines have been drawn in such a way as to prevent him from running without challenging Congressman Price, for example, or taking on a Republican in a Republican district in 2012. And those district lines, absent some effective legal challenge, those district lines would be in place until 2021. So perhaps he did not see opportunity in running again for Congress. There was, though, a lot of speculation about Congressman Price running for elective office within the state of North Carolina in 2012. I was part of conversations about that possibility, but not conversations with Congressman Miller. But he was the topic of conversation. He was under consideration, at least in the press and by active Democrats, under consideration as a candidate for elective office in North Carolina as a state candidate.
Well, I understand that. But my point is that on January 1 of 2013, he was unemployed at that particular point in time.
And as I say, I don't remember when he accepted an employment offer with a law firm in Washington, D.C., but he did, shortly then or shortly thereafter.
It was not unreasonable for him, if he's given money into his campaigns, to ask for the money to come back to him, correct?
And in fact, it was my understanding that he did seek to be repaid by his federal committee, yes.
And that's what I'm getting to. There's more at that time. There was, to the best of your knowledge, I'm not asking for specific amounts, but reportedly more money available. At least that was what was believed in his federal campaign account than there would have been in the state campaign account. Because if there'd been enough money in the state campaign account, it could have just paid him back from there, correct?
At what time, sir?
Well, let's say when he made the decision not to run for re-election, so at the end of January of 2012. The question is, there would have been more money in the federal account than there would have likely been in the state account.
I believe
that
that to be-
dormant for years.
I believe that to be true, yes.
Okay. But there was this amount of money owed to the state account. Correct?
There was an amount of money.
There was an amount of money that the state account owed to him, I should say.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, there are limits. There are ways that a federal campaign account can repay at least portions of a candidate's outstanding debt to a state account. There are limits to doing that, correct?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that question, please?
All right. Well, in other words, let me ask it this way first. So let's say the state account owes in this ballpark sum of about $30,000, just using that as a ballpark sum. You can't, under the federal election laws as you understand them, okay, the federal campaign account cannot write a check for $30,000 to Brad Miller's state account. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
There are limitations on how much money the federal account can pay over or donate over to the state account, correct?
Correct, and that would be a state statutory limit.
Right.
That
In fact, it would be
implicated
about
there.
$4,000 per election cycle, correct?
$4,000 per election was the maximum contribution in 2012
Right.
to a state committee.
Right, because he didn't have any election that year. So if there was like a debt that was incurred, say for, I don't want to confuse this more than it needs to be. If he was running for office, he had a primary and things, that changes things because it creates more election cycles. Each election cycle creates an opportunity to donate. It creates equally an opportunity to pay off debt, correct?
Each election comes with its own contribution limit.
Right.
So if a candidate in 2012 faced a primary contest and a general election, that would be 2 elections and 2 contribution limits.
Right. But in 2012, all that the federal campaign account could give back to the state account for the intended purpose of repaying this loan would be the sum of $4,000, correct?
I believe that's right, sir. One of the things that I would say to you is that kind of question, like many questions in campaign finance law, would give rise to the need for a little bit of research so that I would be satisfied that I knew with confidence the answer. But there was not.
Does
there was
that
not
sound about correct to you?
that
I know
would
that sounds that's
that
kind
would
of a
certainly be
vague
that would
question.
certainly be the maximum at which under state law could be received if there was deemed an election in a year in which the candidate was not on the ballot, because as we are discussing, Mr. Miller had not
He had no
did
election.
not at any time choose to be on the ballot.
Right. He has
in
no
2012.
election going on in 2012.
Correct.
So he'd be permitted just the one
I believe that's correct. Yes.
payment of the $4,000. But that would not satisfy a $30,000 debt. It wouldn't cover it, correct?
I don't
It's
know
simple
what
math.
I don't know what the resources of the state committee were during that time period.
All right. Assuming that there were no money in the state account to pay it, there wouldn't that $4,000 isn't going to cover a $30,000 debt. That's just a general math question I'm asking you.
And right, and that's certainly not going to cover a $30,000 debt.
Did you become aware then that there was a request made as the treasurer of the campaign? If you're not aware, tell me you're not aware, that Congressman Miller. Well, let me back this up because you are an expert in election law. If a candidate decides to, they don't have to. They can refund a donation to a donor. Isn't that true?
Both under state and federal law, a candidate committee may sometimes be obligated to refund a donation, a contribution to a donor. And there are circumstances in which a candidate committee may choose to refund a contribution to a donor.
To the best of your knowledge, there is no law that would say, okay, if you're going to make refunds, then you got to go figure out all the people that donated money to your campaign and then do some pro rata refund to every single contributor. You don't have to do that, do you?
You don't have any obligation. If a candidate committee decides to make refunds, that candidate committee can do so by selecting contributors for refunds, or can do it pro rata. And I've seen both happen.
Right. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly legal. Correct?
Yes.
So in other words, if there's 12 people and they've all given me money and I decide I want to make some refunds to some of the donors, I don't have to give it to all 12. I could give it to 2 or 3 or 4, correct?
Yes, sir.
And decide which ones I want to give it to.
Yes, sir.
Right. Were you aware that Congressman Miller had decided to make specific refunds to certain donors from his federal election campaign, and then asked those donors to take that refund and donate it back to his state campaign so that he could pay off that debt to himself?
I don't believe, sir, that I knew about it in advance. I did hear about it from Mr. Broyhill and or Ms. Hahn at a later time, or perhaps even after the death of Ms. Hahn, I heard about it. But I believe that that was one of the possible lawful means of dispersing the federal committee's resources, was to make refunds to donors, and there would be no prohibition on the state committee soliciting contributions from those same donors for the state committee.
No, there's no legal prohibition on doing that. You can selectively choose what donors you want to make a refund to, and there's nothing wrong with asking those donors to donate that money right back to you, but to a different account, correct?
Correct.
And by the way, this is not an uncommon practice. This isn't some kind of scheme or something that Congressman Miller, other candidates have done this, correct?
I believe I have heard of it being done before. I know it to be permissible. I don't know if I've been involved with a campaign that has made refunds with that purpose in mind, but it's possible.
It is. You've been in the political game for 30 years. You're an election law lawyer. Oftentimes when the elections are going on, you're the guy they come to because candidates are always looking at their opponent's finance practices, correct?
Yes, sir.
If they can find something that the opponent is doing that looks even remotely weird, they don't have and as you said earlier, this is a public document. I mean, all the stuff's on file. They'll go look for it and try to make a big issue out of it, even if it may not be a big issue, correct?
Yes. Happens
with frightening regularity, doesn't it?
I think it happens with great regularity, yes.
So some candidates might shy away from doing this if they thought that this would be something that might come back at them from an opponent looking at it at a later time, correct? I'm not asking you to speculate about candidates. I'm just saying based upon your experience of doing this for 30 years.
I don't know, sir, that it would raise an eyebrow because it would be a lawful and accepted practice. And as I say, there was some discussion about Mr. Miller getting into a state race during 2012. So at some point, money's being solicited for that committee would be usable in a state race. The close of filing would not have been until the end of February.
This method of getting it's a method that other candidates have used to retire a debt.
I believe so. Well, I don't know about to retire a debt. I believe it's a mechanism that can lawfully be used to raise money for a state committee, a non-federal committee, in circumstances in which a balance exists in a federal committee for the same candidate. Yes.
Sure, if you're going to run for a state thing and you want to, listen, I'm going to refund you the money you donated to get me elected into office. I've decided not to run for that office. I'm going to refund you money. Would appreciate it if you made the donation of that money back to my state account because now I'm running for a state office. That's a possibility.
Certainly.
But in this instance, Congressman Miller wasn't running for a state office. He just was looking to get the money back to repay off these loans that he had made to his own state campaign, correct?
I have heard that was under discussion. I don't recall, sir, when I first heard that or whether that did in fact occur as a consequence of any discussion between the congressman and Sky Blue or representatives of Sky Blue.
And the refunds that were made from the federal campaign account to some of those donors, there's limits on that as well, correct?
Well, a refund would not exceed the amount of the original contribution.
We'll get to that. One of the this isn't a foolproof plan if to do something like this, because when you are making a refund to somebody of their donation, the person who's receiving the refund is absolutely under no obligation to give the money over to a state account, correct?
Certainly not, right?
You get a refund back, and if Congressman Miller is asking them to say, hey, can you turn around and donate it to my state account, it's totally up to them whether they want to do it, right?
Certainly.
So I'm assuming, based upon your experience in this, that if you're going to ask people to do this, you're going to sort of handpick the ones you're refunding the money to, because you want to sort of know they're going to return the refund to the other account.
I think there were donors to the Miller Committee that were known to Mr. Miller, and if in fact he was intending to refund contributions, he may well have chosen donors that he knew were recognized, and that would be perfectly lawful, permissible, acceptable.
Absolutely. One thing I want to make clear is there's nothing wrong with doing any of this. If I know you and I say, listen, hey, remember back in the day when I ran and I threw all that money into my state account, and we're close friends, you gave me $2,000. How about if I give you the $2,000 back from my federal campaign because I'm not running anymore? Could you donate it back to my state account? I want to pay back that loan that I put back into the account back whenever it was. And you may have known me for years. Said, yeah, I'll do that. There's nothing wrong with that, correct?
I don't believe there's anything wrong with that, correct?
Right. It's perfectly legal. But in this particular instance of winding down Congressman Miller's campaign, to the best of your knowledge, you may not have been involved in the actual picking, in fact, probably not involved at all in the picking of which donors would get a refund. There was a limit to, there were donors that were selected and there were refunds made, isn't that correct?
I will tell you that I recall that the reports indicated that one or more donors had received refunds. There was difficulty, we had difficulty in ascertaining whether those donors actually received refunds. And a number of donors believed that they had not received refunds.
You've heard quite a bit of testimony, given quite a bit of testimony about what you were able to find out after Ms. Hahn
Yes.
passed away. You went and checked things and found out then that Mr. Broyhill, my client, had been writing checks to himself, the ones that are admitted in evidence now,
Yes, sir.
from the Brad Miller campaign account.
Yes, sir.
Those checks were not authorized by anybody. He had no authority to do that. You agree?
I don't know of any authority that Mr. Broyhill had from Congressman Miller or from Sky Blue, from Ms. Hahn, or from me to write himself a check. I don't believe he had that authority. No.
In fact, I think you may have testified that on those accounts, the only people who, to the best of your knowledge, had signatory power on the account, meaning people who could write a check or actually take money out from the account, lawfully that is, were Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill.
And I believe perhaps Congressman Miller as well.
You don't know that even for a fact, right?
I base that on information I was provided by PNC Bank when I went to secure the account.
So he had signatory power.
I believe that to be true.
Which means he would have had the ability at any given time to go and look into that account, isn't it? I mean, a campaign account is a separate entity, if you will, correct?
It is.
But it is it's tied in with the candidate, and the candidate can have signatory power on the account.
A candidate may have signatory power on the account.
As you sit here today, he may have, and you can't. It sounds like you can't say for certain, but he very well may have.
It very well may have.
And
Yes, sir.
with that signatory power, anybody with signatory power has the ability at any given time to go pull any of the bank statements, look at any of the bank records, look at the checks, look at anything at any given time, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. But prior to April 15th, the day you're meeting with my client and Ms. Hahn, you have not heard a word about anybody Mr. Broyhill writing checks to himself. You didn't know a thing about that.
I did not. No.
You as you said, you didn't look at bank statements because that was not part of your job, correct?
I looked
Other than the pages you said that might be attached as a addendum to, say, one of the reportings.
Yes, which contained dates and amounts of disbursement, but not payees and not images of the instruments themselves.
Right. You're not sitting down poring over bank records looking at the checks that you looked at today that showed, written to Jonathan Broyhill and the amounts that are recited on that, I think it was exhibit number 9, whatever the one that has the listing of them. You had no idea that was going on. Correct?
I did not. Correct.
And as a matter of fact, like you said, you didn't engage Sky Blue Strategies. That wasn't your job as treasurer. But to the best of your knowledge, the way that was supposed to work was they were just going to get their monthly stipend in exchange for the services that they were supposed to provide. And then for that monthly stipend, which I think was $62.50 or something like that.
I believe
a
that's
month,
correct. Yes.
they were supposed to do whatever it is they contracted to do. So you do these things, we give you $62.50 a month, right? Decide not to run for re-election, okay, we're not doing that anymore, but we'd like you to wind it down. Can you do it? It'll only be $2,000 a month because you don't have to do any of the fundraising and stuff.
Eventually, the monthly stipend went from, I believe it was $6,250 to $2,000 a month, but I believe it was relatively late in 2012.
Okay, so the $62.50 might have kept going for a while.
It did.
All right. And in doing that, to the best of your knowledge, there was not, the way the contract worked with Sky Blue Strategies, it wasn't a, we're going to pay you this monthly stipend, and we're going to reimburse you for any expenses you incur. Like if you travel somewhere, you go somewhere, we're going to pick those up too. That was not your understanding of the contract, correct?
I did not participate in the negotiation of the contract. I don't have familiarity with the existence of a written agreement in any form. I do not know, sir, whether Sky Blue's monthly stipend was to have included expenses incurred by Sky Blue or not.
Some agencies, I guess, could be hired under those guidelines, but to the best of your knowledge, that was not supposed to be the case here. Is that correct?
What I'm saying is I don't know what the understanding was here, but Sky Blue certainly had expenses. I believe, for example, that Ms. Hahn went to Washington, D.C. in connection with one or more fundraisers. It would not surprise me if those expenses were borne by the committee.
In addition to the monthly stipend.
Indeed, and that would have been entirely appropriate and lawful. I just don't know whether that in fact occurred or what the understanding was with Sky Blue with respect to that $6,250 fee.
And that wasn't your role.
I didn't have that. I
You
didn't have a role.
You didn't negotiate the contract.
I did not.
Between the campaign committee and Sky Blue Strategies as to what their responsibilities were going to be.
That's correct.
And would it be fair to say with a lot of these campaign committees, they are oftentimes a lawyer's nightmare?
Oh, I don't know that I would agree with that necessarily.
You're smiling.
This committee had as its candidate Congressman Miller was a very capable lawyer himself, and so there are certainly circumstances in which candidates can go astray. This is a situation in which I had confidence in the candidate.
I guess what I mean by that in this election game, and I don't mean to trivialize it, but I mean when a candidate he has other things to do of importance in his job as a congressman. He has to focus on that. He has to focus on what he has to do in Washington in representing his constituents. Oftentimes, people who are in office sort of rely on these people that they put in their campaign committees to sort of take care of that stuff for them because they just don't have the time to do it. Is that fair?
Certainly, he placed this responsibility with Sky Blue, and he entrusted this responsibility to Sky Blue, both because of Sky Blue's capability and because of his need to be able to rely on someone else to provide those tasks that he didn't have time to perform.
That's why I'm saying to you, in politics, people who are politicians, people who are in seated office, oftentimes that's what this is. They delegate the responsibilities out to a committee or other people, and oftentimes those committees are made up of friends or colleagues or people that usually people that share the same political interests as them, and they rely on them to sort of take care of business while they're doing their job.
Certainly.
There was nothing in this scenario that suggested this was any different. Isn't that fair?
No, this was a relatively conventional structure for a campaign in early 2011, a campaign in its infancy in anticipation of the 2012 election.
So this isn't the congressman dropping the ball here. I mean, this is not untypical. He's the politician, the person who's in office, who's representing. Oftentimes, they're not paying attention to what's going on with their campaign committee. They just sort of hope that the people they put in charge are running it well and doing a good job.
Well, let me be clear. I was not engaged with the day-to-day activities of the campaign. I would guess that Congressman Miller had substantially more engagement. I don't know at what level of detail, but I was not part of the campaign strategy for the Miller Committee.
I understand.
I was not part of the fundraising strategy for the Miller Committee. So I wouldn't be able to speak to his level of engagement with Ms. Hahn, for example.
Okay. But getting back to this repayment of the loans by making refunds to certain donors. You indicated you were aware of it.
I became aware of it. I'm not sure when I became aware of it. Yes.
And some of the checks, I mean, that were written back to these donors very early on, or not within a couple of months, within a few months of the time that Congressman Miller decided I'm not running for re-election, and winding down. That be correct?
I don't know when the first of the refund checks were written, sir.
Well, the issue did pop up after you had the meeting with Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill on the 15th, correct?
Correct.
Because I believe your testimony today was, and I absolutely believe quite a bit of time has passed. Actually, I mean we're nearly almost 2 years from that time.
Yes, sir.
That this event occurred. You said something along the lines of you may have been alerted, and I don't think you recalled exactly how you were alerted, but something to the effect of something wasn't right with the FEC website as it pertains to the Brad Miller account, correct?
Well, I met with Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill on the 15th.
That was the Monday.
On the 17th, I observed the two letters on the page for the Miller Committee on the FEC website, the
Right.
letters of October 1st and February 15th.
Stop you for a second and just ask you, in preparation of testifying here today, did you have a chance to look at any of the statements that you made to when you were interviewed by the police or maybe met with the district attorney prior to the trial date?
No, sir.
No notes or anything. So you're operating off your memory here.
I wasn't provided with any notes from interviews.
Do you recall when you met with one of the detectives after this happened, which that was, now you were meeting with detectives shortly after Ms. Hahn passed away, correct? Like within days?
I believe so, sir. I believe that much of the communication was by telephone
Oh, that may be.
during that time period.
I'm sorry. When I say met, I should change it and say you were interviewed by police shortly after the Ms. Hahn.
I believe it was not long after Ms. Hahn's death, yes.
Okay. And you were telling them when you talked with them about how you had the meeting on Monday, the 15th of April, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I believe it was you who told them and that how you got alerted to the FEC website about after, and this was after the meeting, that there was something wasn't right, correct?
My memory of that time period is somewhat vague, but I believe I spoke with Mr. Keating
I was going to ask you that.
during that time period between the 15th and the 17th.
You recall Mr. Keating, who's with the company that previously sort of did the stuff that Sky Blue Strategies did. You remember Mr. Keating giving you a call and saying, hey, if you look at the Brad Miller account on the FEC website, there's a couple of letters on there you need to take a look at.
I believe that in that interval between the 15th and the 17th, I had one or more conversations with Mr. Keating, and I believe it was Mr. Keating that brought those letters to my attention.
This is before you sent the email to Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn, which I think was on, what, the 17th?
Correct.
Which was Wednesday.
Correct.
All right. So sometime after the meeting with them on the 15th and sometime prior to sending this email, you get this alert from Tom Keating that, hey, maybe you better take a look at the FEC website, right?
And I'm not sure how that communication with Mr. Keating was initiated, but I do recall, I believe, speaking with him during that interval, and he brought my attention to this a pair of letters that appeared on the website.
Now that's when you saw the two letters, before you sent out the email to Mr. Broyhill saying basically help, right?
Yes, sir.
Because there was something in one of those letters that was an issue for the Federal Elections Commission with respect to these refunds. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
May I see the state's exhibits, please? And may I approach the witness?
Yes, but we're going to take a mid-afternoon recess and resume at 10 minutes past 4. Ladies and gentlemen, please recall the instructions. Don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about this case. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters. No conversation or communication with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. Please gather in the deliberation room at 10 minutes past 4. Leave your notepads and the papers in your chairs. Thank you.